The icy water slammed into Florence Lancaster with the force of a charging bull, sweeping her feet from under her, as the spring snowmelt turned the normally gentle creek into a roaring monster that had no mercy for a young woman who had simply tried to cross at the wrong moment. She gasped, swallowing water, her heavy skirts dragging her down like anchors as the current carried her downstream faster than any horse could gallop. Her fingers scraped against rocks, finding no purchase, and her lungs screamed for air as her head went under once, twice, the world becoming a chaotic swirl of brown and white foam. This was how she would die, she realized with sudden clarity, drowned in a creek she had crossed 100 times before, all because spring had come early to Nevada in 1876 and melted the mountain snow too fast. Then something solid wrapped around her waist, yanking her sideways with such force that she thought the current had smashed her into a boulder. But boulders did not have arms, and they did not haul her up and out of the water with a strength that defied the rushing snowmelt. She coughed and sputtered, vomiting creek water onto muddy grass as those same arms laid her down on the bank, and a deep voice said words she could not quite make out over the roaring in her ears. "Breathe, just breathe, you are safe now," the voice repeated, and this time she heard it clearly. A man's voice with a rough edge that spoke of years under the sun and wind. Florence rolled onto her side, coughing up more water, her whole body shaking from cold and shock. When her vision finally cleared, she found herself looking up at a man who knelt beside her, water streaming from his own clothes and hair. He had removed his hat, revealing dark hair plastered to his head, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green that reminded her of sage after rain. His face was weathered but young, perhaps 25 or 26, with a strong jaw and a nose that looked like it had been broken at least once. "Can you sit up?" he asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if ready to help but not wanting to presume. She nodded, though her head spun as he helped her into a sitting position. Her teeth chattered so hard she could barely speak, but she managed to force out, "Thank you." "Name is Grant Gibson," he said, already shrugging out of his soaked jacket. "I was riding up from Tonopah Junction when I saw you go in. That creek is not safe this time of year, not with all the melt coming down from the mountains." "I know," Florence said miserably, accepting the jacket he draped around her shoulders even though it was as wet as her own clothes. The gesture mattered more than the warmth it provided. "I have crossed it 1,000 times. I thought I could make it, but the water was faster than I expected." Grant looked back at the creek, which continued its furious rush downstream, carrying branches and debris in its brown current. "You are lucky you did not hit your head on a rock. I have seen men twice your size get pulled under and never come up." Florence shuddered, both from cold and from the reality of how close she had come to dying. "I was trying to get back to town. My horse spooked at a rattlesnake about a mile back and threw me. She ran off, and I have been walking ever since." "Well, you are in no condition to walk anywhere now," Grant said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "My horse is just up the bank. Can you ride?" She took his hand, his grip strong and calloused from years of ranch work, and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs wobbled like a newborn colt's, but she locked her knees and nodded. "I can ride." His horse, a solid bay gelding with intelligent eyes, waited patiently where Grant had ground-tied him. The animal barely flicked an ear as Grant lifted Florence into the saddle with an ease that suggested he was used to handling skittish cattle and stubborn horses. He swung up behind her a moment later, gathering the reins and turning the bay's head toward town. "Hold on," he said, and Florence found herself leaning back against his chest as they started down the trail at a steady trot. She should have been embarrassed. should have insisted on sitting up straight and proper, but she was too cold and too exhausted to care about propriety. Besides, Grant's body was warm despite his wet clothes, and that warmth was seeping into her frozen limbs like sunshine after a storm. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the horses' hoofbeats and the distant roar of the swollen creek. Florence's mind kept replaying those terrifying moments in the water, the way the current had tossed her like a rag doll, the certainty that she was going to die. And then Grant had been there, pulling her out, saving her life without a moment's hesitation. "Why did you jump in?" she asked suddenly, turning her head to look at him. "You could have drowned too." Grant's expression did not change, but something flickered in those sage-colored eyes. "Could not just stand there and watch you die. Would not be able to live with myself if I had. Most men would have at least thought about it first." "Maybe I am not most men," he said, and there was no arrogance in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. Florence studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way he sat the horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his whole life in the saddle. "Where are you from, Grant Gibson? I have not seen you around Tonopah Junction before." "That is because I only arrived 2 weeks ago," he said. "Came up from California looking for ranch work. Got hired on at the Lazy K spread, working as a hand." "The Kesterson place," Florence said, nodding. She knew the ranch, though she had never had cause to visit it. "That is good land." "It is," Grant agreed. "Hard work, but I have never been afraid of that." They crested a rise, and Tonopah Junction spread out before them in the valley below, a small but growing town that served the ranches and mining claims scattered throughout this part of Nevada. The main street was lined with false-fronted buildings, and Florence could see the church steeple rising at the far end, white-painted wood that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "I live above the general store," she told him. "My father owns it, has for the past 10 years. Grant nodded, guiding the bay down the slope toward town. "Lancaster's Mercantile. I have bought supplies there." Florence felt a flutter of something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. Had she seen him in the store? She tried to remember, but the past 2 weeks had been a blur of inventory and customers and helping her father with the books. If Grant had come in, she had not noticed him, and that seemed like a terrible oversight now. They rode into town, drawing stares from the people on the street. Florence knew what they saw. Her soaking wet and bedraggled, wrapped in a man's jacket, riding double with a cowboy they barely knew. The gossip would spread through town like wildfire, but she could not bring herself to care. Let them talk. Grant had saved her life, and that mattered more than any amount of small-town chatter. Grant reined in the bay in front of the general store, and Florence's father came rushing out before they had even dismounted. Peter Lancaster was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a thick mustache and hands that had been scarred by years of hard work before he bought the store. "Florence," he exclaimed, reaching up to help her down from the horse. "What in God's name happened to you?" "I tried to cross the creek," Florence said, her voice small as her father wrapped his arms around her. "The current was too strong. I would have drowned if not for Mr. Gibson here." Peter Lancaster looked up at Grant, who had dismounted and stood holding the bay's reins. The older man's eyes swept over the cowboy, taking in his wet clothes and the determined set of his jaw, and then he stuck out his hand. "Peter Lancaster, I owe you a debt I can never repay." Grant shook his hand firmly. "No debt, sir. I just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Peter said gruffly. "That creek has claimed lives before. You risked your own to save my daughter, and that means something." He turned to Florence, his face stern but his eyes worried. "Get inside and get into dry clothes before you catch pneumonia. I will be up in a moment." Florence nodded, suddenly aware of how cold she was again. now that Grant's warmth was no longer at her back. She started toward the door, then paused and looked back at the cowboy. "Thank you, Grant. I mean it. Thank you for my life." He touched the brim of his hat, water still dripping from it. "Glad I was there at the right time, Miss Lancaster." She went inside, climbing the stairs to the family's living quarters above the store, but she could hear her father's voice through the open window as she stripped off her wet clothes. "You will have dinner with us tonight," Peter was saying in a tone that brooked no argument. "It is the least we can do, 6 o'clock sharp." "I appreciate that, sir," Grant replied. "I will be here." Florence wrapped herself in a thick blanket and moved to the window, watching as Grant mounted his bay and rode off down the street. Even from this distance, she could see the set of his shoulders, the easy way he moved with the horse. He had jumped into a raging creek to save a stranger, had risked his own life without hesitation, and now he was riding away as if it were nothing more than another day's work. She found herself wondering what he was thinking, whether he was cold in those wet clothes, whether he would change his mind about dinner. The thought of not seeing him again made her chest tighten in a way she did not quite understand. Her father came upstairs a few minutes later, his face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Tell me everything," he said, sitting down heavily in his favorite chair. Florence did, leaving out no detail from the moment her horse threw her to the moment Grant pulled her from the water. Peter listened in silence, his face growing paler with each word, until finally he shook his head. "I could have lost you today," he said quietly. "Your mother has been gone 5 years, and you are all I have left in this world, if that young man had not been there." "But he was," Florence said firmly, kneeling beside her father's chair. "He was there, and I am safe, and I am not going anywhere." Peter squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want you to stay out of that creek until the melt is over. Promise me." "I promise," Florence said, and she meant it. She had learned her lesson in the most terrifying way possible. That evening, as 6 o'clock approached, Florence found herself changing her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. She told herself it did not matter what she wore, that this was just a thank-you dinner for a man who had done them a great service. But her hands shook slightly as she braided her dark blonde hair and pinned it up. Grant arrived exactly on time, dressed in clean clothes with his dark hair still damp from washing. He had clearly made an effort, his shirt pressed and his boots polished, and he carried a small bundle wrapped in paper. "Found some peppermint sticks at the store," he said, offering the bundle to Peter with an almost shy smile. "Thought you might like them." "That is very kind of you," Peter said, clearly pleased as he ushered Grant inside. "Florence made roast beef and potatoes, and there is apple pie for dessert." The dinner was surprisingly easy despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Grant had a dry sense of humor that emerged as the evening progressed, and he told stories about his time working ranches in California that had both Florence and her father laughing. He spoke about growing up in Sacramento, the son of a blacksmith who had died when Grant was 16, leaving him to make his own way in the world. "I tried my hand at smithing for a while," Grant said, accepting a second slice of pie from Florence. "But I was never as good at it as my father. One day I got on a horse to deliver some work to a ranch outside town, and I realized that was what I wanted to do. Work with horses and cattle, be outside under the sky instead of inside breathing forge smoke." "And you have been cowboying ever since?" Florence asked, fascinated despite herself. "For 9 years now," Grant confirmed. "Work spreads all over California, even spent a year in Colorado, but I heard there was good work in Nevada, so I headed this way." "Planning to stay in Tonopah Junction long?" Peter asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Grant met his gaze steadily. That depends on whether I can make a life here. I am tired of drifting, Mr. Lancaster. I want to find a place to put down roots, maybe save enough to buy my own land someday. Florence felt that flutter in her chest again, stronger this time. A man looking to settle down was different from a drifter passing through. And the way Grant said it, the quiet determination in his voice, made her believe he meant it. After dinner, Peter excused himself to do some bookkeeping downstairs in the store, leaving Florence and Grant alone for the first time since he had pulled her from the creek. An awkward silence fell, both of them aware of the impropriety of being unchaperoned, but neither willing to end the evening just yet. "Walk me outside," Grant asked finally, rising from his chair. Florence nodded, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as they stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk in front of the store. The spring evening was cool but pleasant, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above Tanapa Junction. "I wanted to thank you again," Florence said, looking up at him. "I know I said it before, but it does not feel like enough. You saved my life, Grant." "You do not need to keep thanking me," he said, but his voice was gentle. "I am just glad I was there." "But you were," Florence insisted. "You were there, and you did not hesitate, and that says something about the kind of man you are." Grant was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "My father used to say that a man's character shows in what he does when no one is watching. I suppose jumping into that creek was just instinct, but if it was, then maybe that says my father raised me right after all." "He did," Florence said softly. "He raised you to be brave and selfless, and the world needs more men like that." Grant turned to look at her then, and in the fading light his eyes looked more green than gray. "Can I ask you something, Florence?" The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her, though he had every right to use it after what they had been through. "Of course." "Would you let me call on you?" The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back all evening. "I know we only just met and under strange circumstances, but I would like to get to know you better. If that is something you might want to." Florence's heart hammered in her chest. She had been courted before, by the banker's son and by a mining engineer who had passed through town last year. But she had never felt this way about any of them. Grant was different, not because he had saved her life, but because of something deeper, something she could see in the way he carried himself and spoke and looked at her with such honest hope in his eyes. "Yes," she said, and the smile that spread across his face made her own smile in return. "I would like that very much." Grant reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused fingers. "I work most days, but I get Sunday afternoons off. Could I take you for a proper ride this Sunday, somewhere far from that creek?" Florence laughed, the sound bright in the evening air. "That sounds perfect." He left soon after, riding off into the night on his bay gelding, but Florence stood on the sidewalk for a long time after he was gone, her hand still warm from his touch, and her heart fuller than it had been in years. The next few days passed in a strange sort of anticipation. Florence helped her father in the store, serving customers and restocking shelves, but her mind kept wandering to Sunday afternoon. She caught herself watching the door, hoping Grant might come in for supplies, but he did not appear. On Saturday, a woman named Martha Williams came into the store, her eyes bright with gossip. "I heard you nearly drowned in the creek, Florence Lancaster, and that a cowboy from the Lazy K fished you out. Is it true?" Florence kept her expression neutral as she wrapped Martha's purchases in brown paper. "It is true. The snowmelt made the current stronger than I expected, and I was fortunate that Mr. Gibson was nearby." "Gibson," Martha said, tasting the name. "I have seen him around town. Handsome fellow, if a bit rough around the edges. Is he calling on you now?" "That is none of your concern, Martha." Peter said firmly from behind the counter, and Martha had the grace to look embarrassed as she took her packages and left. But the gossip had started, and by Sunday morning half the town seemed to know that Florence Lancaster was being courted by the cowboy who had saved her from drowning. Florence tried not to let it bother her, but she could feel the weight of curious eyes as she walked to church that morning. Grant was waiting outside the general store at 2 o'clock that afternoon, his bay gelding and a pretty little sorrel mare tied to the hitching rail. He had cleaned up again, his face freshly shaved and his shirt neat, and when he saw Florence he broke into a smile that made her stomach flip. "Borrowed the mare from the Lazy K," he explained, helping her into the saddle. "Her name is Daisy, and she has the sweetest temperament of any horse I have ever known. She will not spook at rattlesnakes or anything else." Florence settled into the saddle, adjusting her riding skirt. "Where are we going?" "Thought I would show you a place I found last week," Grant said, swinging up onto his bay. "If you trust me enough to follow." "I trust you," Florence said, and meant it. They rode out of town, heading west, away from the treacherous creek, and toward a line of low hills that rolled across the landscape like sleeping giants. Grant set an easy pace, clearly in no hurry, and they talked as they rode about everything and nothing. He asked about her mother, and Florence found herself telling him about the fever that had taken her 5 years ago, how hard it had been to lose the woman who had been her anchor and her friend. "She would have liked you," Florence said impulsively. She always said the measure of a person was not in their words but in their actions, and your actions speak volumes. Grant looked pleased but also a bit embarrassed. "I am just a cowboy, Florence. I work with my hands and sleep in a bunkhouse with 5 other men. I do not have much to offer anyone." "You have yourself," Florence said. "That is more than enough." The place Grant led her to was a small meadow nestled in a fold of the hills, where wildflowers were just beginning to bloom in patches of purple and yellow. A spring bubbled up from the rocks at one end, forming a small pool before trickling away downhill, and the whole place felt like a secret world hidden from the rest of Nevada. "I found this while checking fence lines last week," Grant said, dismounting and helping Florence down from Daisy. "Thought it might be the prettiest spot I have seen in a long time." They sat on a flat rock near the spring, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Florence trailed her fingers in the cool water, so different from the violent snowmelt that had nearly killed her, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. "Tell me about your dreams," she said to Grant. "What do you want out of life?" Grant was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant horizon. "I want land of my own someday. Not a huge spread, just enough to run some cattle and horses. A house I built with my own hands, solid and strong enough to last generations. And I want a family, a wife and children who know they are loved and safe." "That sounds like a good dream," Florence said softly. "What about you?" Grant turned to look at her. "What do you dream about?" Florence had never put her dreams into words before, but with Grant they seemed to flow out easily. "I want to keep helping my father as long as he needs me, but someday I would like to have my own home too. I want to grow a garden and raise children who know the value of hard work and kindness. And I want to love someone who loves me back, truly and completely, the way my parents loved each other." "Those are good dreams too," Grant said, and there was something in his voice that made Florence's breath catch. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the clouds drift across the sky and listening to the birdsong in the surrounding hills. When Grant finally reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I know this is fast," he said quietly. "We have only known each other a few days, but I feel something when I am with you, Florence, something I have never felt before." "I feel it too," Florence admitted, her heart racing. "It scares me a little how strong it is." "Scares me too," Grant said with a small smile. "But I figure sometimes the best things in life are a little scary. They matter enough to make you nervous." Florence squeezed his hand, marveling at how right it felt to be here with him, in this hidden meadow with wildflowers blooming around them. "My father likes you, by the way. He does not say much, but I can tell." "I like him too," Grant said. "He is a good man, and he raised a remarkable daughter." They rode back to town as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. When Grant helped Florence down from Daisy in front of the general store, his hands lingered on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "Can I see you again next Sunday?" he asked. "Yes," Florence said without hesitation. "And maybe during the week too, if you find yourself in town." "I will make sure to find myself in town," Grant promised, and the warmth in his eyes made Florence feel like she was glowing from the inside out. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt both new and familiar. Grant came to town whenever he could spare the time, stopping by the store to buy supplies he may or may not have actually needed, just to see Florence. They took walks through Tanapa Junction in the evenings, always properly chaperoned by the presence of other townspeople, and every Sunday afternoon they rode out to their meadow, which they had started calling their place even though neither of them owned it. Florence learned more about Grant with each passing day. She learned that he was left-handed and could whittle beautiful little figures from scraps of wood. She learned that he had a terrible singing voice but hummed while he worked anyway. She learned that he was fiercely loyal to his friends, protective of those weaker than himself, and had a stubborn streak a mile wide when it came to things he believed in. Grant learned about Florence too. He learned that she loved to read, but had to hide her favorite novels from her father, who thought they were too scandalous. He learned that she could do figures in her head faster than most men with pencil and paper, and that she had a dream of expanding her father's store into a proper mercantile empire someday. He learned that she was afraid of spiders but not of horses, and that she made the best apple pie west of the Mississippi. By the time summer arrived in full force, baking the Nevada landscape into shades of brown and gold, everyone in Tanapa Junction knew that Grant Gibson and Florence Lancaster were courting seriously. The gossips had moved on to other scandals, satisfied that the Cowboy's intentions were honorable and that Florence was clearly head over heels for him. One Sunday in early July, Grant arrived at the store looking nervous in a way Florence had never seen before. His hands fidgeted with his hat brim, and he seemed unable to meet her eyes directly. "Something wrong?" she asked, worried that he had come to deliver bad news. "No, nothing wrong," Grant said quickly. "I just need to talk to your father. Is he here?" Peter was in the store, and Grant disappeared with him into the small office in the back. Florence tried not to eavesdrop, but the store was quiet and the office door was thin, and she heard Grant's voice saying something about intentions and future and permission. Her heart began to pound so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. When they emerged 15 minutes later, Peter looked pleased and Grant looked relieved. Her father caught her eye and nodded, just once, and Florence had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. "Florence," Grant said, taking her hand and leading her outside. "Walk with me." They walked to the edge of town, to a spot where the street gave way to open land and the mountains rose purple in the distance. Grant stopped there, turning to face her, still holding both of her hands in his. "I talked to your father," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion Florence could see in his eyes. "I told him that I love you, Florence Lancaster. I told him that you are the finest woman I have ever known, and that every day I spend with you makes me want to be a better man. I told him that I do not have much to offer right now except hard work and an honest heart, but that I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted choosing me." Florence's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling so wide her face hurt. "What did he say?" "He said yes," Grant said, and now he was smiling too. "He said if you will have me, he gives his blessing." Then Grant was kneeling in the dust, still holding her hands, looking up at her with his whole heart in his eyes. "Florence Lancaster, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who loves you more than anything in this world?" "Yes," Florence said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, Grant, of course yes." He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as they both laughed with pure joy. When he set her back on her feet, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, gentle and sweet and full of promise. "I will build us a house," he said when they finally broke apart. "I have been saving every penny, and Mr. Kesterson at the Lazy K said he would sell me 20 acres on the edge of his property at a fair price. I can start building next month, and we could be married by winter." "By winter," Florence repeated, trying the words on for size. By winter she would be Florence Gibson, married to this incredible man who had saved her life and then stolen her heart. "That sounds perfect." They walked back to the store hand in hand, and when Peter saw their faces he laughed and pulled them both into a hug. "I knew from the moment I saw you pull her from that creek," he told Grant. "I knew you were the one." The engagement was announced, and Tanapa Junction celebrated with them. The women of the town threw Florence a party, giving her linens and dishes and advice about marriage. The men slapped Grant on the back and bought him drinks at the saloon, welcoming him properly into the community now that he was going to be one of them, permanently. Grant threw himself into building their house with a determination that bordered on obsession. He worked his regular hours at the Lazy K, then spent every evening and weekend on the property he had bought, cutting timber and hauling stone and laying foundation. Florence visited whenever she could, bringing him food and water and trying to help where she was able. "You are working yourself too hard," she scolded one evening in August, watching him hammer boards into place despite the sweat pouring down his face. "I want it to be perfect for you," Grant said, pausing to wipe his forehead. "You deserve a real home, Florence, not some thrown-together shack." "I would live in a tent if it meant being with you," Florence said honestly, "but I love that you care so much." The house took shape slowly but surely. It was not large, just 3 rooms and a porch, but it was solid and well built, with windows that let in the light and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm in winter. Grant carved their initials into one of the porch posts, G and F surrounded by a heart, and Florence cried when she saw it because it made everything feel so real. They were married on a crisp December morning in the Tanapa Junction church, with the whole town in attendance. Florence wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and carried wildflowers that Grant had somehow found blooming in a protected corner of their property. Grant wore a new suit that Peter had insisted on buying him, and his hands shook slightly as he slipped the simple gold band onto Florence's finger. "I promise to love you and protect you for the rest of my life," Grant said during the vows, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to build a life with you that is full of joy and laughter and love. I promise to be worthy of the gift you have given me by saying yes." "I promise to stand beside you through everything," Florence replied, tears streaming down her face. "I promise to be your partner and your friend and the mother of your children. I promise to love you with my whole heart from this day until my last day." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Grant kissed her with such tenderness that half the women in the church started crying. The reception was held at the general store, with food and music and dancing that lasted until well after dark. That night, Grant carried Florence over the threshold of their new house, both of them laughing as he nearly tripped on the doorstep. He had lit candles throughout the small space, and a fire crackled in the fireplace, making everything warm and welcoming. "Welcome home, Mrs. Gibson," Grant said, setting her gently on her feet. "Home," Florence repeated, looking around at the house they would fill with love and life and years of memories. "It is perfect, Grant. Everything is perfect." Their first year of marriage was not easy, but it was good. Grant continued working at the Lazy K while building up his own small herd of cattle on their 20 acres. Florence helped her father in the store during the days and came home to cook and clean and take care of their little house in the evenings. Money was tight, and there were times when they ate nothing but beans and cornbread for weeks on end, but they were happy. Florence discovered she was pregnant in the spring, almost exactly a year after Grant had pulled her from the Snowmelt Creek. She told him over dinner, watching his face transform from confusion to understanding to absolute joy in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We are going to have a baby." "In the fall," Florence confirmed, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" "Happy," Grant laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Florence, I am the happiest man alive." Their son was born in October of 1877, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. They named him Peter Grant Gibson, after both his grandfathers, though everyone called him Pete from the start. Grant held his son with shaking hands, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of absolute wonder. "I am a father," he said, sounding dazed. "Florence, we made a person." "We did," Florence said tiredly from the bed, exhausted but glowing with joy. "And he is perfect." Peter Lancaster doted on his grandson, spoiling the boy with candy and wooden toys carved during slow hours at the store. Grant proved to be a natural father, patient and loving and endlessly entertaining to his son. Florence watched them together and felt her heart expand with a love she had not known was possible. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Caroline, who had Grant's green-gray eyes and a stubborn streak that rivaled her father's. Grant built them a bigger house on the property, 4 rooms now with a proper nursery, and Florence planted a garden that became the envy of every woman in Tonopah Junction. Grant's cattle operation grew steadily. He was a smart rancher, conservative with his money and willing to work harder than anyone else. By 1882, he was running 300 head of cattle and had hired 2 hands to help with the work. The Lazy K-Tikes owner, old Mr. Kesterson, had retired and sold his spread to a consortium from back east. But Grant had made enough of a name for himself that he no longer needed to work for anyone else. Florence expanded her role in her father's store, taking over more of the management as Peter grew older. She proved to have a gift for business, negotiating deals with suppliers and expanding their inventory to include items that other stores in the region did not carry. By the time their 3rd child, a son they named Thomas, was born in 1883, the Gibsons were considered one of the most successful families in Tonopah Junction. But success had not changed them fundamentally. Grant still worked alongside his hired hands, refusing to ask anyone to do work he was not willing to do himself. Florence still helped customers in the store with the same warmth and kindness she had shown when she was single. They raised their children to value hard work and compassion, to treat everyone with respect regardless of their station in life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grant took Florence back to the meadow where he had first held her hand. The children were with Peter for the afternoon, giving them a rare moment alone together. They sat on the same flat rock by the spring, older now but no less in love than they had been as a young cowboy and the woman he had pulled from the creek. You ever think about that day? Florence asked, trailing her fingers in the cool water just as she had a decade ago. The day you saved me. Every day, Grant said honestly. I think about what might have happened if I had been 5 minutes later, if I had decided to take a different trail. I think about how I almost lost you before I even knew you. But you did not, Florence said, leaning her head on his shoulder. You were there exactly when I needed you, and you have been there every day since. Grant wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. You saved me too, you know. Before I met you, I was just drifting, going from job to job with no real purpose. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. You gave me a family and a home and a life worth living. We gave that to each other, Florence corrected gently. That is what love is, Grant. Two people choosing each other every single day, building something together that neither could build alone. They sat in their meadow as the sun tracked across the sky, talking about their children and their dreams and the life they had built together. When they finally rode back to town, both of them were thinking the same thing, that they were the luckiest people in the world to have found each other. Peter Lancaster passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1886, leaving the store to Florence. She cried at his funeral, but she also smiled, because she knew he had died happy, surrounded by the family he loved and knowing that his daughter was well cared for. Grant held her through her grief, steady and strong as always, and when she was ready to return to work, he was there to support her. Florence transformed the general store into something bigger, adding a second story and expanding the inventory to include everything from farm equipment to ladies' fashions. She hired staff to help run the day-to-day operations, freeing herself to focus on the larger business decisions. Grant supported her completely, proud of his wife's accomplishments and never threatened by her success. Their children grew into remarkable people. Pete, serious and hardworking like his father, started helping with the ranch when he was barely tall enough to sit a horse properly. Caroline, bright and stubborn, announced at age 8 that she wanted to be a teacher and never wavered from that goal. Thomas, the baby, had his mother's head for numbers and his father's easy charm, a combination that suggested he would do well at whatever he chose to pursue. In 1889, Florence gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Emma, who kept the entire household in chaos with their boundless energy and matching mischievous grins. Grant built yet another addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, and Florence hired a woman from town to help with the housework and cooking. On a warm evening in the spring of 1891, Florence and Grant sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Pete, now 13, was teaching Thomas how to rope a fence post. Caroline was reading to the twins under a tree, her patience with her younger sisters seemingly endless. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and well-maintained, and the distant mountains glowed pink in the setting sun. "Did you ever imagine this?" Florence asked Grant, gesturing to the scene before them. "That day in the creek, did you imagine it would lead to all of this?" Grant considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "I could not have imagined something this good. I hoped for it, dreamed about it in a vague sort of way, but the reality is so much better than anything I could have pictured." "Me too," Florence said, taking his hand. "I am so grateful, Grant. For you, for our children, for the life we have built. Every single day I am grateful." "I am the grateful one," Grant insisted, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "You took a chance on a cowboy with nothing but dreams and calloused hands. You made me a better man, Florence. You made me the luckiest man in Nevada." They sat together as twilight deepened into night, watching their children and counting their blessings. Pete drove a practice throw that actually caught the fence post, earning a whoop of celebration from Thomas. Caroline looked up from her book to smile at her parents, a smile that said she knew exactly how fortunate they all were. The twins raced each other to the porch, demanding attention and hugs before bedtime. Grant gathered Sarah into his arms while Florence scooped up Emma, and they herded their 5 children inside for the evening rituals of dinner and baths and bedtime stories. Later, when the house was finally quiet and dark, Grant and Florence lay in their bed with the window open to let in the cool night air. "I love you," Grant said, the same 3 words he spoke every night before they fell asleep. "I love you too," Florence replied, the same answer she had given every night for 15 years. They fell asleep holding hands, the way they always did, their hearts beating in the same rhythm they had shared since the day a current tried to pull Florence under, and a cowboy refused to let her go. The years continued to flow past like a river, steady and strong. Pete grew into a fine young man and took over more of the ranch operations, allowing Grant to slow down slightly, though he never truly retired. Caroline went to Teachers College in Carson City and returned to Tonopah Junction to teach at the schoolhouse, becoming beloved by every child in town. Thomas joined his mother in running the store, his natural business sense making him an invaluable partner. The twins, inseparable as always, grew into beautiful young women who kept their parents on their toes with their various schemes and adventures. They reminded Grant of Florence sometimes, the way they faced the world with courage and determination, and that made him love them even more fiercely. More grandchildren arrived over the years. Pete married a rancher's daughter from the next county over, and gave them 2 grandsons who inherited their grandfather's skill with horses. Caroline married the new banker in town and had 3 daughters who were already showing signs of their mother's intelligence. Thomas and the twins were still young yet, but Grant and Florence looked forward to whatever family they might eventually bring into the fold. On a spring morning in 1901, Florence and Grant rode out to their meadow, something they still did several times a year despite being in their 50s now. The wildflowers were blooming just as they had been that first time Grant brought her here, and the spring still bubbled up clear and cool from the rocks. 25 years, Florence said, settling onto the rock that had become theirs through decades of visits. 25 years since you asked me to marry you right here in this spot. Best decision I ever made, Grant said, sitting beside her. Well, second best. First was jumping into that creek after you. Florence laughed, the sound still bright and young despite the gray threading through her hair now. Those decisions are connected, you know. You cannot have one without the other. Then I am grateful for both, Grant said, pulling her close. Every day of the past 25 years has been a gift, Florence. Even the hard days, even the days when the ranch struggled or the children were sick or money was tight. Every single day with you has been worth living. For me too, Florence said softly. You saved me that day in the creek, Grant, but you have been saving me every day since. With your love and your strength and your unwavering faith that we could build something beautiful together. They kissed there in their meadow, the same meadow where they had fallen in love, and the years melted away until they were 22 and 25 again, a cowboy and a shopkeeper's daughter dreaming about the future. But unlike those younger versions of themselves, they knew now what the future held. They knew about the laughter and the tears, the triumphs and the struggles, the children and grandchildren who would carry their legacy forward. They knew that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made over and over again through decades of shared life. They rode back to their ranch as the afternoon sun painted everything golden. Their house, expanded and remodeled over the years, stood solid and welcoming on the Nevada landscape. Smoke rose from the chimney where their cook was preparing the evening meal. In the distance, they could see Pete working with the hands, moving cattle to fresh pasture. This was their life, built from nothing more than courage and love and hard work. This was their legacy, measured not in money or land but in the family they had raised and the love they had shared, and the community they had served faithfully for decades. That evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren who had come for Sunday dinner, Florence looked around the table and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. Grant caught her eye from the other end of the table and smiled. And in that smile, she saw everything they had been and everything they were, and everything they would always be to each other. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the grandchildren were playing in the yard and the adults were relaxing on the porch, Florence stood and raised her glass of lemonade. "I want to make a toast," she announced, and everyone quieted. 26 years ago this spring, I made a foolish decision to try to cross a creek swollen with snowmelt. I should have died that day, but a cowboy I had never met jumped into that current and pulled me out. That cowboy became my husband, the father of my children, and the love of my life. So I want to toast to Grant Gibson, who saved my life and then filled it with more love and joy than I ever dreamed possible. To Grant, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Grant stood then, his eyes bright with emotion. And I want to toast to Florence, who took a chance on a penniless cowboy with nothing but dreams, who built a business and a family and a life that makes every hardship worthwhile, who has been my partner and my love and my reason for everything. To Florence. To Florence, the family echoed. Their children and grandchildren might not have fully understood the depth of what their parents were saying, but they felt it in the way Grant and Florence looked at each other, in the love that still burned as bright as it had the day they met. As the evening deepened into night and the family gradually dispersed back to their own homes, Grant and Florence sat on their porch swing, rocking gently and watching the stars emerge overhead. "You think we did well?" Florence asked quietly. "With our lives, with our children, with everything?" Grant was silent for a moment, considering. "I think we did the best we could with what we were given. We loved each other and our children. We worked hard and treated people fairly. We built something lasting that will go on after we are gone. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Florence agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Nothing at all." They sat together in the darkness, two people who had found each other through chance and grace and a cowboy's courage. The ranch was quiet around them, settled in for the night. Inside the house, the fire was banked and the lamps were turned low. Everything was as it should be, as it had been built to be through 26 years of shared life. "I love you, Florence Gibson," Grant whispered into the night. "I love you, Grant Gibson," Florence whispered back. And there, on the porch of the house they had built together, surrounded by the land they had tamed and the family they had raised, they held each other close and counted themselves blessed beyond measure. The spring snowmelt that had nearly claimed Florence's life had instead given her the greatest gift imaginable. A love that would last all her days, a partner who would stand beside her through everything, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Years later, when they were both old and gray, and surrounded by great-grandchildren who looked at them with wonder, people would ask Florence about the secret to a long and happy marriage. She would smile and take Grant's weathered hand in hers and say simply, "Choose someone who will jump into the current for you, and then choose them again every single day for the rest of your life." And Grant would nod and add, "And be someone worth jumping in for." They lived out their days on their ranch in Tonopah Junction, never wealthy by some standards but rich beyond measure in the ways that truly mattered. They saw their children grow and thrive and have families of their own. They weathered droughts and hard winters and economic downturns, always together, always choosing each other. When Grant passed away peacefully at the age of 82, with Florence holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed, his last words were, "Thank you for letting me love you." Florence lived another 5 years, staying active in the family businesses and doting on her ever-growing collection of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never remarried, saying that she had already had the great love of her life and needed no other. On the day she died, surrounded by the family that was Grant's and her greatest achievement, her last coherent words were about the cowboy who had pulled her from the creek all those years ago. "He saved me," she whispered to Caroline, who sat beside her bed. "And then he loved me. What more could I have asked for?" They buried her next to Grant on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The whole town of Tonopah Junction came to the funeral, paying respects to a woman who had been a pillar of their community for more than half a century. And when the last prayers were said, and the last flowers were laid, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood together on that hill and told stories about the love that had started with a rescue and grown into something that would echo through generations. Because that is what true love does. It starts with a single moment, a single choice, a single act of courage, and then it grows and deepens and spreads until it touches everyone around it, creating ripples that flow out into the world long after the original moment has passed. Grant and Florence's love story began in the spring snowmelt of 1876, when a cowboy saw a woman drowning and did not hesitate to save her. But it did not end there. It grew through courtship and marriage, through children and grandchildren, through joy and sorrow, and everything in between. It grew until it became more than just their story. It became a testament to the power of choosing love, of building something beautiful together, of never letting go even when the current tries to pull you under. And in a little meadow on the edge of the Gibson Ranch, where wildflowers bloom every spring and a clear spring bubbles up from the rocks, you can still feel the echo of that love if you sit quietly enough. You can feel it in the way the wind moves through the grass and in the peace that settles over the place like a blessing. This is where it all began, that love. And in a way, this is where it lives still, eternal and unchanging. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when we are brave enough to jump into the current for someone else, and from the grace of finding someone who will do the same for us. Their story is finished now, complete and perfect in its own way. Grant and Florence Gibson lived and loved and built a legacy that continues through their descendants, through the ranch that still operates under their grandchildren's care, through the store that bears their name in Tonopah Junction, and through the memory of a love that began with a rescue and grew into something that changed everyone it touched. And if you visit that little meadow on the right spring day when the wildflowers are blooming and the spring is running clear, you might just catch a glimpse of them. A cowboy and his wife, sitting on a rock by the water, holding hands and smiling at each other with all the love that 50 years of marriage can create. They are gone now, both of them, but their love remains, carved into the land they cherished and written into the hearts of everyone who knew them. This is their story, from beginning to end. A story of courage and love, and the beautiful life that can grow from a single moment of choosing to jump into the current instead of standing safely on the shore. A story that proves, beyond any doubt, that true love is not found but built, day by day, choice by choice, until it becomes something that can never be washed away, not even by the strongest current or the longest years. The end.